Pack your things, I sold the house. My son said it while I was still holding the knife over my 70th birthday cake, the candles flickering in front of me as if they hadn't heard him properly. For a moment I thought I hadn't either. The room was warm, filled with soft yellow light, the kind I had always loved for family gatherings. The dining table was set with my best china, the one I had saved for years to buy, each plate polished that morning with careful hands. There were flowers, white lilies my favorite, arranged in the center, their scent gentle and familiar. Everything looked exactly how a birthday should look. Everything except the faces around me. Daniel didn't smile when he said it. He didn't even look at me. He was staring at his phone, one hand in his pocket, as if he were mentioning the weather or a minor inconvenience. Ashley stood beside him, her arms folded lightly, her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't sympathy either. The kind of expression you wear when you're waiting for something to unfold exactly as planned. I lowered the knife slowly, placing it beside the cake. The frosting was untouched, a perfect circle with Happy 70th, Mom written in blue icing that now felt almost mocking. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting, not toward me but away from me, as if no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just been said. My granddaughter fiddled with her napkin. My nephew suddenly became very interested in the centerpiece. No one spoke. Not even me. I had learned a long time ago that silence reveals more than anger ever could. It's done, Daniel added after a moment, still not meeting my eyes. The paperwork went through this morning. This morning. On my birthday. I nodded once, a small movement, controlled, measured. I see, I said, my voice steady enough that it surprised even me. I picked up a candle that had begun to tilt, straightening it gently, as if that small act could restore balance to something much larger. Inside something had shifted, but it wasn't breaking. Not yet. Because the truth was, this wasn't the first strange thing I had noticed. 3 days earlier, I had seen an email flash across Daniel's tablet when he left it on the kitchen counter. Just a subject line. Final transfer confirmation. He had taken the device quickly when he returned, too quickly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I hadn't asked then. I rarely asked questions anymore. Questions, I had learned, often came with answers people weren't ready to give honestly. Instead I watched. I listened. I remembered. Now, standing in that dining room with the candles still burning and the cake still whole, I realized this moment had not arrived suddenly. It had been built quietly, piece by piece, in conversations I wasn't included in decisions made behind closed doors, in glances exchanged across rooms when they thought I wasn't looking. I reached for the napkin beside my plate and folded it carefully, smoothing out the edges with deliberate precision. You should blow out the candles, Ashley said lightly, her tone bright, almost cheerful, as if she were helping me move past an awkward interruption. I looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see my daughter-in-law. I saw someone waiting for me to leave. I turned back to the cake. The candles flickered again, smaller now, their flames bending under a draft I couldn't feel. I leaned forward, took a breath, and blew them out in one steady motion. The room fell into a brief, soft darkness before the overhead lights seemed brighter than before. And in that quiet, with the smoke curling upward in thin, fading lines, I realized something with perfect clarity. They thought this was the moment I lost everything. They were wrong. I stayed seated long after the candles had gone out, watching the thin trails of smoke disappear into the air as if nothing had happened at all. Someone finally cleared their throat. A chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor. The room began to move again, slowly, cautiously, like people stepping around something fragile they did not want to name. My granddaughter asked if she could have a slice of cake, her voice small but eager, and Ashley laughed lightly as if that was all the permission the room needed to return to normal. Plates were passed. Forks touched porcelain. Conversations restarted in careful fragments that never quite formed into anything real. I served the cake myself, steady hands, even slices, making sure everyone had what they wanted. I had done this for decades. Hosting. Providing. Making sure everyone felt comfortable. It was a role I knew by heart. And yet, as I handed Daniel his plate, he barely looked up, offering a quick thank you that sounded practiced, like something you say out of habit rather than meaning. I took my seat again and placed my untouched slice in front of me. The frosting glistened under the light, perfect and sweet, but I did not lift my fork. I simply sat there listening. That was when I began to hear it. Not words at first, but tones. The quiet confidence in Ashley's voice. The way Daniel spoke in short, certain sentences, as if decisions had already been finalized long before tonight. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no room for discussion. Whatever had been done, it had been done completely. "We will need to coordinate with the realtor next week," Ashley said at one point, her voice lowered but not enough. "And the staging company." Staging. The word settled into me slowly. I glanced up just briefly, and caught the way Daniel nodded without looking in my direction, his attention fixed on his glass. They were not talking about a possibility. They were talking about a plan already in motion. I folded my hands in my lap, pressing my fingers together just enough to feel the pressure. 3 days. That email had not been a coincidence. It had been a confirmation. The house. My house. The one I had lived in for 35 years. The one where I had raised Daniel, where every doorway held a memory, every window a season of my life. And now it had been reduced to a transaction discussed over dessert. I let my gaze drift around the room, taking in the details I had once taken for granted. The small crack in the molding near the window. The faint mark on the wall where a picture frame had hung for years. The way the evening light settled into the corners of the room, soft and familiar. I wondered briefly if they had already imagined this space without me in it. If they had already walked through it in their minds, rearranging furniture, replacing memories with something newer, something that belonged to them instead. "Mom, you will need to start packing soon," Daniel said after a while, finally looking at me, though his eyes did not linger. "The buyers want to move quickly." Buyers. Plural. So it was already done. Not a discussion. Not a suggestion. A completed decision delivered as a courtesy. I nodded again, the same small, controlled motion as before. "Of course," I said quietly. My voice did not shake. It did not rise. It did exactly what I needed it to do. It remained calm. Inside, however, everything had sharpened. Not pain. Not panic. Something clearer than that. Awareness. I picked up my fork then, cutting a small piece of cake and bringing it to my mouth. It tasted exactly as it always had. Sweet. Familiar. Predictable. And yet, as I set the fork down, I realized that nothing in this room was what it appeared to be anymore. Not the celebration. Not the people. Not even the house itself. Because while they believed they had already taken it from me, they had forgotten something simple. I had been the one who kept every document, every receipt, every detail for decades. And I never forgot where anything was. The house grew quiet after everyone left. The kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful, only empty. I stood at the sink for a long time, rinsing plates that did not need rinsing, letting the warm water run over my hands as if it could steady something inside me. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second sounding louder than it should have, filling the space where voices had been just an hour before. When I finally turned off the faucet, the silence settled in fully, pressing gently against every corner of the room. I dried my hands on a towel I had used for years, the fabric worn soft with time, and I looked around as if seeing the kitchen for the first time. Every cabinet, every drawer, every small detail had been chosen carefully, piece by piece, over decades. Nothing here had ever been accidental. And yet, somehow, I had allowed myself to believe that the same care had extended to the people in my life. I walked slowly into the living room, my footsteps light against the hardwood floor, and paused near the window. The street outside was calm, a few porch lights glowing in the distance, the familiar outline of the neighborhood unchanged. It was strange how everything beyond these walls remained exactly the same while everything inside had shifted so completely. I rested my hand against the back of the armchair Daniel used to sit in as a boy, remembering how his feet once did not touch the ground when he climbed into it, how he would lean against me during long evenings, asking questions about things that felt so important at the time. Back then, this house had been more than a structure. It had been safety. It had been certainty. I moved toward the hallway and stopped in front of the small closet near the stairs. For years, it had held coats and shoes, ordinary things that required no thought. But behind the coats, tucked neatly in a locked metal box on the top shelf, was something far less ordinary. I reached up, sliding the box down carefully, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. The key was exactly where I had always kept it, hidden in a place no one ever thought to look because no one had ever needed to. I opened the box slowly, not with urgency, but with the calm precision that had guided me through most of my life. Inside were folders, each one labeled in my handwriting, each one containing records I had kept without fail. Deeds, statements, agreements, copies of documents that most people would have trusted others to manage. I had never been most people. I sat down at the dining table again, the same table where everything had changed just hours before, and placed the folders in front of me. The surface still held faint marks from plates and glasses, small reminders of the evening that had just passed. I opened the first folder and flipped through the pages, scanning lines I already knew by memory. Dates, signatures, terms. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Nothing missing. Nothing altered. I paused on one document in particular, my fingers resting lightly against the paper as I read the name printed at the top. Not Daniel. Not anyone else. Mine. Always mine. I leaned back slightly in my chair, the weight of the realization settling in fully now, not as a shock but as confirmation. They had moved quickly, yes. They had been confident, certain even, that what they were doing could not be questioned. But confidence without understanding is a fragile thing. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my movements unhurried. Upstairs, the house remained still, as if it too were waiting to see what I would do next. I looked toward the staircase, then back at the documents in front of me, and for the first time that night, a quiet sense of clarity settled over me completely. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. I did not go upstairs that night. Instead, I remained at the dining table long after the clock passed midnight, the documents spread neatly in front of me, each page a quiet witness to decisions made years ago when life still felt steady and predictable. I traced the edges of one folder with my fingertips, remembering the day I signed those papers. It had been a warm afternoon in early spring, sunlight pouring through the office windows, your father sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly over mine as if to remind me that everything we had built was meant to last. He had insisted on it, not out of fear but out of clarity. Things change, he had said back then, his voice calm, certain. People change. But what we build should not be left unprotected. At the time I had smiled at him, thinking he was simply being careful, the way he always was with finances, with planning, with anything that involved the future. I had trusted that our son would never be the kind of man who needed to be protected against. I had believed that love, once given, stayed intact. Now, sitting in the same house we had fought so hard to afford, I realized how much of that belief had been hope rather than truth. I opened another folder and reviewed the trust agreement again. Slower this time, letting each line settle fully in my mind. The structure was clear, precise, and above all deliberate. Ownership, control, transfer conditions. Nothing left vague. Nothing left to interpretation. The house was never something that could simply be sold on a decision made over dinner. Not without my consent. Not without my signature. And I had not signed anything. I leaned back in my chair, allowing the silence of the house to wrap around me again. But this time it felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that allows thoughts to sharpen instead of scatter. I thought about Daniel, about the boy who once asked me if we would always live here, who had cried when we first moved in because the rooms felt too big, too unfamiliar. I had promised him then that this house would always be his home. And in many ways it had been. But somewhere along the years that meaning had changed. For him it had become something to claim. For me it had remained something to protect. I gathered the papers carefully, aligning them with the same precision I had used when I first filed them away. There was no urgency in my movements, no rush to act. Plans made in anger rarely end well, and I was not angry. Not in the way people expect. What I felt was clearer than that. A steady understanding of what needed to be done and when. I stood up slowly, carrying the folders with me as I walked toward the small desk in the corner of the room, the one I had used for years to keep track of bills, schedules, and everything that kept a household running. I placed the documents inside, locking the drawer with a soft click that echoed gently in the quiet space. Tomorrow would come soon enough. There would be conversations, assumptions, perhaps even instructions directed at me, as if I were simply expected to comply. I had seen that tone already in Daniel's voice, in Ashley's careful suggestions. But tonight was not for them. Tonight was for remembering exactly who I had been long before any of this, and exactly what I had put in place to ensure that I would never be left without a choice. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the house slowly, deliberately, until only the soft glow from the hallway remained. When I reached the staircase, I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the railing polished smooth by years of use. This house had held every version of my life, and now it was about to reveal another. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that soft gray light that makes everything feel suspended between yesterday and today. For a few seconds I lay still listening. The quiet was complete. No footsteps upstairs. No voices in the kitchen. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. It was the kind of morning I used to treasure, when the day felt open and full of possibility. Today it felt different. Not heavy, not rushed, just precise, as if every moment had already been assigned its place. I got up slowly and made my way to the kitchen, my movements automatic, practice from years of routine. Coffee. 1 cup. Black. I stood by the window as it brewed, watching the light shift across the backyard, the same yard where Daniel had once chased a ball across the grass, where birthday parties had been held, where laughter used to carry through the open windows in the summer. I poured the coffee and took a small sip, letting the warmth settle into me. Then I set the cup down and walked back to the desk in the corner of the dining room. The drawer opened smoothly, just as it always had. The folders were exactly where I had left them. I took out the one I needed and carried it with me to the table, placing it carefully in front of me before sitting down. The paper felt cool under my fingers as I opened it, but my hands were steady. I read through the document again, slower this time, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to confirm every detail with complete certainty. The trust had been established 12 years ago. The property had been transferred into it shortly after. The conditions were clear. No sale. No transfer. No change in ownership without my direct authorization. Not implied. Not assumed. Explicit. I closed the folder and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I had not needed to call in years. Harold Bennett, the attorney who had drafted every document in front of me. The man who had sat across from my husband and me and asked the kind of questions people do not always want to answer but should. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then his voice, slightly older now but still steady. "Margaret," he said, a hint of surprise in his tone. "It has been a while." "It has," I replied, my voice even. "I need to review something with you." There was a brief pause, not of hesitation but of understanding. "Of course," he said. "When can you come in?" I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after 7, early enough to move before assumptions had time to settle into actions. "This morning," I said. "If that works." "It does," he replied without question. "I will make time." I ended the call and sat there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, the quiet of the house now carrying a different weight. Not uncertainty. Direction. I stood up and walked toward the staircase, moving with purpose but without haste. Upstairs, the rooms were exactly as they had been the night before, untouched, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all. I paused at the doorway of my bedroom, taking in the familiar arrangement of furniture, the soft light filtering through the curtains, the stillness that had once felt comforting. Then I stepped inside and began to get ready, not as someone preparing to leave, but as someone preparing to be heard. Downstairs, the coffee had gone slightly cooler, but I drank it anyway, finishing the last sip before placing the cup in the sink. I picked up my keys, the folder tucked securely under my arm, and walked to the front door. As I opened it, the morning air met me with a quiet clarity, cool and steady. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a soft, final click. They believed everything had already been decided. They were about to learn how wrong that was. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always had, the building exactly as I remembered it, quiet and orderly, with glass doors that reflected a version of me that looked no different than yesterday, and yet felt entirely changed. The receptionist recognized my name before I even finished saying it, her polite smile steady as she gestured toward the seating area. But I did not sit. I stood near the window instead, watching the city move in its usual rhythm, people walking with purpose, cars stopping and starting, everything continuing as if nothing in the world had shifted. That was the strange part about moments like this. Life did not pause just because yours had changed direction. "Margaret," Harold's voice came from behind me, warm but measured, the same tone he had always used when discussing matters that required precision. I turned to face him, noting the lines time had added to his face but not to his focus. "It has been too long," he said, extending his hand. "It has," I replied, returning the gesture briefly before handing him the folder. There was no need for small talk. He understood that immediately. We moved into his office, the same one where decisions had once been made with clarity and foresight rather than urgency. I took a seat across from his desk as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with a familiarity that came from years of careful work. He did not speak right away. He never had. Instead, he read thoroughly, line by line, page by page, as if each word deserved its own moment. I waited, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze steady, not on him, but on the small details of the room I remembered so well. The framed certificates on the wall, the neatly stacked files, the pen placed precisely at the corner of his desk. Nothing here had changed in any careless way. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. "You have not signed anything," he said. It was not a question. "No," I answered simply. He nodded once, as if confirming what he had already expected. "Then the property has not been legally transferred," he continued, his tone even. "Regardless of what has been said to you, no sale can be completed without your authorization under the trust." I let those words settle, not because I needed reassurance, but because hearing them spoken aloud gave them weight beyond paper. "They believe it has been sold," I said after a moment. Harold's expression shifted slightly, not into concern, but into something sharper. "Understanding. Then someone has either misunderstood the structure," he said carefully, "or chosen to ignore it." I did not respond right away. I did not need to. We both knew which of those was more likely. "What are my options?" I asked, my voice calm, controlled. Harold leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "First, we verify if any contracts have been presented to third parties," he said. "If so, they are invalid without your consent. Second, we ensure that all relevant parties are notified of the actual ownership status. And third," he paused briefly, his eyes meeting mine directly, "we decide how you want to proceed with your son." The word hung there for a moment. Not emotional, not personal, just factual. I held his gaze, considering not the question itself, but the weight behind it. For years, I had made decisions with Daniel in mind, with his future, his comfort, his stability as the quiet priority behind everything. Today, that priority had shifted. Not into anger, not into punishment, but into clarity. "We proceed with the truth," I said finally. Harold nodded once, a small, decisive motion. "Then we will handle this properly," he replied. He reached for a notepad, already beginning to outline the steps ahead, each one precise, measured, controlled. I watched him for a moment, then allowed myself a single steady breath. This was no longer about what had been said at a dinner table or assumed in a moment of confidence. This was about what was real, what was documented, what could not be changed by convenience or desire. And for the first time since the candles had gone out, I felt something settle completely into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, just certainty. When I stood to leave, Harold walked me to the door, his expression unchanged but his tone firm. "You are not without standing," he said. "Not even close." I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, then stepped back into the hallway, the folder now lighter in my hands than it had been when I arrived. Outside, the day had fully begun, the sunlight stronger now, clearer. I walked toward my car without hesitation, already knowing that the next conversation would not be like the last, because this time I would not be listening. This time I would be the one speaking. I pulled into the driveway just before noon, the sunlight now high enough to cast sharp lines across the front of the house, highlighting every familiar detail with a clarity that felt almost deliberate. For a moment I remained in the car, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, My gaze fixed on the front door. Nothing about the house had changed. The curtains were still drawn the way I had left them. The small crack near the porch step was still there, just as it had been for years. It looked exactly like home. And yet I knew that inside, something had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. Stepped out of the car and closed the door quietly behind me, the sound soft but final. As I walked up the path, I noticed a second car in the driveway. Daniel's. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He had not waited. He had not paused to consider timing or courtesy. He had moved forward, confident that everything was already his to manage. I reached the front door and opened it without hesitation. The air inside was different. Not unfamiliar but occupied. Voices carried faintly from the living room, low and conversational, not tense, not uncertain. Comfortable. I stepped inside fully and set my keys down on the small table by the entrance. The sound of metal against wood enough to announce my presence without a word. The voices stopped immediately. I walked into the living room at a steady pace, my posture straight, my expression unchanged. Daniel was standing near the window, his sleeves rolled up slightly, his phone in his hand. Ashley sat on the couch, a tablet resting on her lap. Between them on the coffee table were papers. Printed. Organized. Prepared. Daniel turned first, his expression shifting only slightly when he saw me, more surprised than concerned. "You are back early," he said, his tone neutral, as if I had simply returned from a routine errand. I looked at him for a moment, then at the papers on the table, then back at him again. "I had something to take care of," I replied evenly. Ashley offered a small smile, polite but measured, the kind that does not invite conversation but acknowledges presence. "We were just going over some details," she said, gesturing lightly toward the papers, as if including me in the process after the fact made it acceptable. I stepped closer to the table, my gaze moving over the documents without touching them. Contracts. Listings. Numbers. All arranged as if they were already valid. Already binding. Already decided. I let the silence stretch for a moment, long enough for the weight of it to settle into the room. Daniel shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "We wanted to get ahead of things," he said, his voice carrying a hint of justification now. "The market is good right now, and the buyers are serious." "Buyers?" Again. I nodded once slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "I see," I said. I reached down. Then, not to pick up the papers, but to straighten one corner that had curled slightly upward. A small, precise movement that drew both of their attention. "You have been busy." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm. "We thought it would be easier this way," she said. "Less stress for you." I looked at her then, meeting her eyes fully, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with something steadier. Awareness. "Easier," I repeated softly. Daniel stepped in then, his voice firmer, as if sensing the need to assert control. "Mom, everything is already in motion," he said. "We just need you to cooperate so we can move forward." The word hung in the air. Cooperate. As if this were a process I had been invited into rather than excluded from. I let a small pause pass between us, just long enough for the assumption behind his words to fully reveal itself. Then I placed my hands lightly on the back of the chair beside me, grounding myself not in the moment, but in the certainty I now carried with me. "No," I said quietly. The room stilled. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just enough. Daniel frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, as if the word itself did not fit into the outcome he had already imagined. "No," he repeated. I held his gaze, my voice calm, measured, and entirely certain. "Nothing has been sold," I said. "And nothing will be without my consent." For a moment no one moved. The air in the room shifted, not with noise, but with something quieter and heavier, like a realization settling into place that no one had prepared for. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Mom," he said, his tone tightening slightly, "that is not how this works." I did not respond immediately. I simply reached into my bag and placed the folder I had carried back from the office onto the table beside their neatly arranged papers. The sound it made as it touched the surface was soft, but it carried through the silence with a clarity that drew both of their eyes toward it. Ashley's posture shifted first, her attention sharpening, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her tablet, as if she were recalculating something she had already assumed was settled. Daniel's gaze followed more slowly, his expression moving from confusion to something closer to concern. "What is that?" he asked. I opened the folder with the same measured care I had used earlier that morning, turning it so that the documents faced them, not me. "The only documents that matter," I said evenly. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the pages, his movements no longer as controlled as before. Ashley leaned forward as well, her calm beginning to thin at the edges. I watched them both without speaking, allowing the information to reach them in its own time. That was always the difference between assumption and truth. One is fast, the other is patient. "This does not make sense," Daniel said after a moment, his voice lower now, less certain. "I handled everything. I spoke to the agent. I signed the paperwork." I tilted my head slightly, not in disagreement but in acknowledgement. "You may have signed something," I replied, "but you did not have the authority to sell this house." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. Ashley reached for one of the pages, her eyes moving quickly now, searching for something that would confirm her understanding, something that would restore the version of events she had already accepted as real. "This says the property is held in a trust," she said, her voice steady but thinner than before. "Yes," I answered. "A trust that requires my direct authorization for any sale or transfer." Daniel shook his head once, as if the motion alone could correct what he was hearing. "That is not what I was told," he said. I met his gaze not with challenge but with clarity. "Then you were not told the full truth." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. Not avoidance. Not discomfort. Recognition. The kind that arrives when something can no longer be ignored or explained away. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his movements less composed now, his certainty unraveling in small visible ways. "The buyers have already put down a deposit," he said, as if that detail could anchor the situation back into place. I nodded slightly. "Then they will be informed that the sale is invalid," I replied. Ashley sat back slowly, her expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. The confidence that had been there earlier had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, replaced by calculation of a different kind. "This is going to complicate things," she said carefully. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but to let the weight of her words settle fully. "No," I said quietly. "It clarifies them." Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since the night before, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the one he had already decided could be managed, directed, moved aside. "Why did you not say anything before?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to give him the right one. "Because you had already decided what you believed was true," I said. "And I needed you to see the difference for yourself." I closed the folder gently, my hands steady, my movements unhurried. "Now you have." Daniel did not speak right away after I closed the folder. He stood there, staring at the table as if the answer might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. Ashley was the first to move, slowly gathering the papers they had brought, stacking them neatly, though her hands were no longer as steady as before. The confidence that had filled the room when I arrived had thinned into something quieter, something more cautious. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly against the back of the chair, giving them the space to process what they had not expected to hear. It was not anger that filled the room. It was something more revealing than that. Uncertainty. "So what happens now?" Daniel finally asked, his voice lower, the certainty from the night before gone. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief moment I saw not the man who had stood in front of me and told me to pack my things, but the boy who once asked me if everything would always stay the same. I held that image for just a second, then let it go. "Now," I said calmly, "we deal with what is real." He nodded slowly, though it was clear he was still trying to understand how what he believed had unraveled so quickly. Ashley stood up then, smoothing her dress with a small, controlled motion, her expression composed again, though no longer certain. "We should contact the agent," she said, her tone measured. "And the buyers." I inclined my head slightly. That would be appropriate, I replied. There was no need to say more. The steps ahead were no longer assumptions. They were facts. Daniel exhaled quietly, running a hand over his face as if trying to reset something that could not be reset. I thought, he began then stopped. I did not finish that sentence for him. Some realizations have to be completed in silence. I moved around the table then, gathering my folder and holding it close, not protectively, but with the quiet assurance of someone who knows exactly what it contains. You thought you could decide without me, I said, not harshly, not accusingly, just plainly. He did not argue. That, more than anything, told me he understood. The room settled into a stillness that felt different from the one the night before. Not empty. Not fragile. Clear. Ashley picked up her tablet and slipped it into her bag, her movements efficient again, though more careful now, as if every action required a second thought. We will sort this out, she said, glancing briefly at Daniel then at me. I met her gaze steady and calm. Yes, I said. We will. I walked past them toward the hallway, not to leave, but to move through the space as I always had, without hesitation, without needing permission. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had been restored. Not ownership. That had never truly been lost. Clarity. I paused briefly at the doorway, my hand resting against the frame, and looked back once more. Daniel was still standing near the table, quieter now, his posture less certain, his expression thoughtful in a way I had not seen in years. Ashley stood beside him, composed but watchful, already adjusting to a reality that no longer followed the path she had expected. I did not say anything else. There was nothing left to explain. Some lessons do not need to be spoken aloud. They reveal themselves in what remains after assumptions fall away. I turned and continued down the hallway, my steps steady, my pace unhurried, moving through the house not as someone being asked to leave, but as someone who had never truly lost her place within it. Because in the end, they had not taken anything from me. They had only revealed what they were willing to risk. And I had simply reminded them what was never theirs to take. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.